Hello, I'm Debbie Goddard from WIHD, the Community Support Network in Valhalla, New York. Today with me is Stephanie Ballantoni, the Assistant Director of Family and Community Training for Inclusion and Self-Determination, a colleague of mine also at WIHD. I invited Stephanie to talk with me today because we have been having this conversation in the office about one-on-one support. And I deem her an expert on it. And so I wanted to get some of her insights about the purpose of it, how it can be done better, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of it. So I will start at the very beginning. What is the purpose of the one-on-one aid?
So good morning, Debbie. I'm flattered that you deem me an expert in anything. I guess I do have experience in this area. I have a daughter who's 14 who has always had one-to-one support since forever. And, obviously we could read the regulations and we could look at all the nitty-gritty textbook definition of what it means, but through all the ins and outs of preschool through 8th grade, I think it's fair to say that the purpose of that one-to-one national setting is to support that student in accessing their education, whatever that may be. So in the case of my daughter who has an intellectual disability, but she is included in general education classes, the job is twofold. So that one-to-one TA is responsible to identify where she's having trouble accessing the content of the work that her peers are working on. So for example, if she's given an assignment or a task to do, all of her work, of course, is modified for her. But if she's not able to access it or do it independently, that one-to-one is there to recognize that, adapt where they can, and if not, go back to the teacher and say, the student's having difficulty accessing this. As a parent, I feel like almost more important than that is that other piece of my daughter's education, that learning how to be a socially and educationally appropriate member of her community in school, which, for those of you out there who have kids with more significant disabilities, I think you'd agree with me. Sometimes you feel those are going to be the bigger obstacles for her in life than, not being able to graph quadratic equations, right? I mean, I think the bigger issue is going to be, can she be socially appropriate? Can she be part of a team? Can she respect authority? Can she follow through with a task? Those kinds of things. So it's a heavy lift. It's a heavy lift.
Do you think the one-to-one helps in those transitions?
I think that, we've had a different one-to-one every year, which has its pros and cons. I like it that way. I don't really want my daughter to get hung up on one person. Mm-hmm. And everyone's different, right? And some teaching assistants are older, some are younger, some are more of disciplinarians, mm-hmm. Some are more, they're almost like a companion. Right. And I don't really think I could sit here and say any of that is right or wrong because she needs it all, right? Mm-hmm. She does need to be told sometimes, you're stepping out of line, right? Right. But if I had to, define what those best qualities would be, it's that person who recognizes that they're not the teacher, they're not the principal, they're not there to say no, no, no. Mm-hmm. They're there to really prompt my daughter and remind her of what her goals are and what she's trying to accomplish. And that's not an easy thing to do. Living with her 24/7, I know it's not an easy thing to do. We're human. So it's a tightrope act. It really is. It's a tough job.
Yeah. No, I know that because my son, who has autism and is now post high school, had one for most of elementary and middle school, and the switch happened at high school, and I was really amazed at how easy the transition was from having that one-to-one to really. He sort of almost flourished post-Aide because he kind of found that, I can do all these things by myself. And he embraced it. And I saw some growth there that I was really thrilled about. But I don't think he wouldn't have been able to do that had he not had the support in the younger grades. because I
Yeah.
think they sort of laid the groundwork. And so
Mhm.
he learned what the routines were. He learned what his expectations were just from having that extra support that says, let's do it this way instead. So it
Right.
served its purpose. And when he was ready to launch, you could see the difference.
Well,
So
that's exciting to hear at the point that I'm at.
yeah, no, I mean it's a hard call, but you really will be surprised at how the transition is. It happens. They
Yeah.
just pick it up and they grow, because I think for him it also coordinated with a growth spurt for him. You know, with autism, there seems to be these plateaus and these valleys, and he just spurts and then stops, and you go, oh no, there's nothing else happening, and then you get another spurt and it
Right.
stops again. So
Right.
that just happened to coincide wonderfully together, and so the transition was really easy.
Yeah.
But going back to sort of what the one-on-one does, can you tell me some of the disadvantages to that?
So some of the disadvantages, and I think the reason why, at least in New York State, the education department's really gone out of their way to make it really difficult for districts to establish the need for one. And I think the reason for that is because, and I'm comfortable to say this as the parent of a child who's always had one, you don't want one if you don't need one.
Right.
I think had our team been more progressive in the past 4 or 5 years, she wouldn't still have one right now. What happens is they become completely dependent on that one-to-one, and depending upon the level of independence the team is promoting. And I can't even say the TA, because really your committee on special education are the ones who are determining where that TA is supposed to be supporting and where they're not, right? So in my daughter's IEP, it says something along the lines of, Jessica is to navigate the building like a typical middle school student and be provided support when needed. And I'm pretty sure if any of us watched what goes on a day-to-day basis, that might not be what you see. And I don't say that from a sense of blame. It's just the natural course of going through your day. So depending upon how Jessica is day to day, and depending upon just the nature of the day and who that TA is, you know, you get into that learned helplessness piece, right? So
It's true.
yeah, my daughter is completely capable of navigating the building, opening and closing her locker, doing most of the things that a middle school student does, but she'll do it slower and she'll lose track of what she's doing, which is where the prompting is necessary. But you're talking about a school day where bells are ringing and periods are ending,
Right,
and
of course.
people are rushing all around, and it's a normal inclination for that person to say, come on, Jessica, let's go. Come on, let's go. And kind of,
Right.
I'll hold your binder. Let's go. And so, again, I'm not in the building. I don't know that those things are happening, but it's a very easy trap to fall into, which kind of, if you give me another 2 minutes, it kind of goes back to that first question you asked of what's the purpose of the TA?
Right.
And I think it's really important for teachers, parents, everybody to remember that the goal of that TA is not to make that child be typical. It's not to make that child jump through all the hoops that the typical kids are jumping through. It's not. And that's a big misconception, because then the goal becomes making it to 3 o'clock and getting everything done, rather than, did Jessica really grow and become independent today?
Right.
And I keep saying her name, but I mean, that's my level of
Right,
experience,
right,
but really,
of course.
child. So I think it's important, if this is a conversation at your child's CSC meeting, to really, really think about, with your team, are we jumping to this teaching assistant support because we need it, because it will be easier for us to navigate the day, or are we doing it because this student needs it? And that's a big.
So that leads to the next question.
Yeah.
How are some of these goals, how will they be able to be met otherwise, right? What are some of the other things that schools might be able to put in place to meet these same goals without using a TA?
Right. So the best examples I can think of, and I'll go chronologically backward, most recently, before we got sent home, they had
From
just
school?
they had just
From the
started
principal's office.
Yeah. Well, we all got sent home. We had just started to make some real milestones. They had actually pulled the teaching assistant for half the day, or the first 3 periods of the day. And she was, for the most part, successfully navigating that, getting from class to class. a minute or two late the first day or two, but then she kind of got the hang of it. And she really, it was relayed to me. I wasn't there watching it, obviously, but some of the teachers in the building shared with me that they would see her. And, one time they actually saw her walking into class with a peer, which had never happened.
Nice.
And just like the look on her face and the sense of confidence and I'm doing this, right?
Right.
It's really like 1,000-pound weight to have someone over your shoulder watching you all the time. And I think that especially for kids with higher support needs, you start out in kindergarten. This is just my gut at this point, looking back 15 years, not 15 years, looking back 10 years. It was kindergarten, right? I'm pretty sure she could have done everything they were doing in kindergarten without support. But she was probably the first, if not the first, one of the first kids with Down syndrome, with an intellectual disability in a general education setting. So my committee was like, well, we're going to have a teaching assistant assigned to her. And, at the time I didn't have all these opinions. I didn't really know. And I was like, okay. But then you started a pattern and then it never went away. Right. And I think, when she was 5, there were safety concerns. As she got older, there were issues about other kids being nice. And, when you start to talk about those things, those are not really about her. Right. If the kids are not being nice, she doesn't need a one-to-one TA.
Right.
Maybe
she can't
sensitivity training in your classroom. Right. So it's important to think about, am I putting this in place? And when I say I mean the CSE team. Am I exploring this because this child really needs this and there's nothing else that can help? It really should be a last resort. If there are, let's say Jessica was not successfully getting from class to class. One of the things I've heard some families have done is they've used the smartphones, right? Or if they don't have their own smartphone, when you get to math, have Mrs. Jones text me, right? So the next teacher's going to text and say, Jessica got here, right? There are other ways. They're time consuming, it takes a little bit of roll up your sleeves, but there are other ways. There are little, somebody had suggested a little tag on her binder where she would check off where she had to go next. And,
I'm also thinking that this is probably a good place to, sort of insert that social support too, because if she has a classmate who has a similar schedule to her, right? There's no reason why they can't walk together. And sometimes maybe having that TA is a buffer between her and having those social interactions in a way. Because if that adult is always there, she becomes less approachable.
Absolutely. There was actually, when she was younger, I can't remember what grade it was, but I remember we were there for open house night and the desks all had the kids' names on them. And right next to Jessica's desk was Mrs. So-and-so. And it didn't really hit me at the time. I was like, okay, that's her TA. But if you think about it, and then as you get older, even in middle school, we had an issue where she had a TA who was sitting with her at lunch, and
that's not conducive to social interactions at all.
Right. So, our kids with disabilities are going to struggle socially anyway. And that's just an added barrier, to have an adult standing there. Once we sort of massaged that a little bit and had the TA back off, there was 1 or 2 other girls and they started to play like Uno during lunch. They started to play a card game. And then, the school actually implemented a peer buddy system. But all of that happens when the TA is backing away. And
so it opens more opportunities for her.
Oh, definitely.
So now that she's home, right, and she's going to go back to school, hopefully either in May or in September, are there any goals you have personally of how to kind of get her ready for the next phase of school and taking the TA into consideration? Is there some way that you're thinking of how to prepare her to sort of completely wean her, or do you think she's still going to be needing some support?
Well, I am hoping that the conversation will continue to go in a forward direction because we were making progress with that. The high school in my district is pretty big. And, it's tough to navigate. But in the back of my head, I'm thinking, I have a son starting high school next year too, and he's going to get lost too. And I think about that. And so I'm a little bit on the fence about it. I think that conversations need to take place not only with regard to her navigating the building, but navigating her schedule. I mean, she just selected her electives for next year, and she did it, I talked her through it, but they were her choices. Honestly, they were not the classes I would have picked for her, but those were her choices.
And that's great, because you're giving her a little
Yep.
autonomy now. You're saying, Jessica,
Yeah.
you can make these decisions, and that's a forward move.
Yep.
That's great. I
And
always commend parents of just giving that self-determination,
Right. Well, and I think when your child is younger, you are all about, jumping all over the team if the modifications are not appropriate or if something is too difficult. And as she gets older, I almost feel, because I worried about with the electives, right? So these elective teachers are not necessarily experienced with special education students. But then I thought about it and I said to myself, well, just like any other student, if she starts an elective and for whatever reason she's not enjoying it or she's not successfully engaging in it, yes, we could have a conversation about adaptations, but she could also drop it if she wants to.
Exactly.
I mean, and it's something that, as she gets older, as parents, I think as our kids get older, you got to stop trying to fix everything. I mean, you're not going to fix everything, and things are not going to be perfect. And I want her to start to recognize, you know what, I'm having more success with that teacher, not that one. And it's not about mom going into the IEP meeting and putting the hammer down. It's about she's making choices and she's identifying it, right? So she can go in and say, well, I really like it when my English teacher does X, Y, and Z. And then, whether or not another teacher who's not doing it is going to pick up on that, it's not really my job or her job to fix that. So it's a lot of letting go, which Debbie, you and I talk about that a lot in the office.
Yep.
You're a little bit
and you're making progress, so I'm very proud of you.
I am, and you're always sitting right here when I start to go the wrong way. But they do grow up. I mean, the one thing we always say, kids with disabilities are more like other kids than not, and one of the ways they are is that they do grow and they do mature and they become adults, and they can't necessarily do things the way that we do them, and they don't necessarily want to. I mean, they're them. They're not.
And they're total individuals with their own personalities. So you kind of have to let those shine through. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for chatting with me today and talking about your experience. This has been great. I'm Debbie Goddard from the Community Support Network, talking to Stephanie Ballantoni, a colleague of mine at the Community Support Network also. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Debbie.